I've always loved the woods. Growing up in a small town surrounded by dense forests, I spent most of my childhood exploring them, building forts and pretending I was an adventurer discovering new lands. It was my escape, my sanctuary. But after what happened last year, I can't go near the woods without breaking into a cold sweat. My name's Danny, and I'm 23 now. But this story happened when I was 22. My best friend Mark and I had a tradition. Every summer we'd go on a weekend camping trip deep into the woods, far away from the hiking trails and campgrounds. We liked the solitude, the sense of being miles away from civilization. It was a chance to disconnect from the world and enjoy the raw beauty of nature. Last summer was supposed to be no different. We packed our gear, loaded up Mark's old Jeep, and drove out to our usual spot, a secluded area near a small, serene lake. The first day was perfect. Clear skies, warm sun, and just enough of a breeze to keep the bugs away. We set up camp, fished in the lake, and cooked our dinner over an open fire. By nightfall, we were sitting by the campfire, drinking beers and telling stories like we always did. As the night wore on, a thick fog rolled in from the lake, shrouding the woods in a dense mist. It was eerie but beautiful, the kind of scene you'd see in a horror movie. Mark, being the jokester he is, started telling ghost stories, trying to scare me. I laughed it off, but there was something about the fog that made everything feel different. The usual sounds of the forest, crickets, owls, the rustle of leaves, were muted, almost as if the fog had swallowed them up. "Do you hear that?" Mark asked suddenly, his voice barely above a whisper. I listened, straining my ears, but all I could hear was the crackling of the fire. "Hear what?" I asked, feeling a chill run down my spine. "It's like, whispering," he replied, his eyes scanning the foggy woods. "I swear I heard someone whispering." I laughed, trying to shake off the creeping fear. "You've had too much to drink," I said, tossing another log on the fire. "There's no one out here but us." But as the log caught fire, crackling and spitting, I heard it too. A soft, distant whispering, just at the edge of hearing. I couldn't make out any words, but it sounded like several voices murmuring in unison just beyond the wall of fog. "Did you hear it?" Mark asked, his voice tense. "Yeah," I whispered back, my heart starting to race. "Maybe it's just the wind." But deep down, I knew it wasn't the wind. I've spent enough time in the woods to know what the wind sounds like, and this was different. This was human. We sat there in silence, listening, trying to convince ourselves it was nothing. But the whispering continued, growing louder and closer. It was coming from all around us, encircling us. I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck standing up, my instincts screaming at me to leave. "Maybe we should head back to the Jeep," I suggested, trying to keep my voice calm. "Just to be safe." Mark nodded, his face pale in the firelight. We grabbed our flashlights and started packing up our gear, moving quickly but trying not to panic. The whispering grew louder as we worked, and I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. As we finished packing, I caught a glimpse of something moving in the fog. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the light. But then I saw it again, a dark shape, tall and thin, moving between the trees. My heart skipped a beat. "Mark," I whispered, "do you see that?" He looked up, his eyes wide with fear. "Yeah," he said quietly. "We need to go. Now." We slung our backpacks over our shoulders and started walking toward the Jeep, our flashlights cutting through the fog. The whispering followed us, growing louder with each step, and I could hear movement in the woods around us, branches snapping, leaves crunching underfoot. I felt like we were being hunted. We broke into a run, our breaths coming in ragged gasps. The fog was so thick I could barely see a few feet in front of me, but I could feel the presence behind us closing in. Then, out of nowhere, Mark stumbled and fell. I turned back, my heart pounding in my chest, and helped him to his feet. His face was pale, his eyes wide with terror. "I saw one," he gasped. "Right there, behind that tree." I glanced over my shoulder and saw a dark figure standing just beyond the edge of the fog, watching us. It was tall, impossibly thin, its limbs too long, its face obscured by shadows. I felt a surge of panic. "Come on!" I shouted, pulling Mark along. We ran harder, pushing through the fog, until we finally broke into the clearing where we'd parked the Jeep. I could see the outline of the vehicle through the mist, and relief flooded through me. We sprinted toward it, throwing our gear in the back and jumping in. I fumbled with the keys, my hands shaking, and finally got the engine started. As we drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror and saw them. Dozens of dark figures standing at the edge of the clearing, watching us leave. They didn't move, didn't chase us. They just watched, their eyes glowing faintly in the darkness. We didn't stop driving until we reached town. We didn't talk about what happened, not at first. But I could tell Mark was just as shaken as I was. We both knew what we'd seen wasn't normal, wasn't natural. There was something in those woods, something that didn't want us there. It took me weeks to get over the fear, to stop seeing those dark shapes every time I closed my eyes. Mark and I haven't been back to those woods since, and I don't think we ever will. Whatever is out there, it's watching, waiting, and I'm not about to find out what it wants. I've been a hunter for as long as I can remember, and the deep woods never scared me. The silence, the isolation, that was the best part. A man alone with nature, away from the noise of the world. But this time, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. It wasn't the usual uneasiness you get when the woods go too quiet. This was different. The air felt thick, heavy, like I was being watched, though I couldn't see by what. I'd been tracking a buck for 3 days, deeper into these woods than I'd ever gone before. I knew these forests like the back of my hand, but the further I went, the more unfamiliar everything became. The trees grew taller, their branches more twisted, like ancient hands reaching out of the earth. The ground was soft beneath my boots, and the canopy overhead blocked out most of the light, giving everything a dark, almost dreamlike quality. By the time I set up camp that evening, I could feel a storm brewing. The wind picked up, carrying with it the smell of rain. The sky was a dull, oppressive grey, and the air was cold, biting at my skin despite the time of year. Still, I built a fire and tried to shake the strange feeling gnawing at me. As the fire crackled, I caught something out of the corner of my eye. A figure just past the clearing, standing between the trees. At first, I thought it was another hunter, someone who had wandered into the same area. But the way they stood there, so still, so silent, it wasn't right. I called out, but there was no response. They didn't move. I stood up, grabbed my rifle, and called out again. Nothing. And then, just as quickly as it appeared, the figure stepped back into the trees and vanished. My skin prickled, every hair on my neck standing on end. I told myself it was nothing, probably just some hiker who didn't want to make contact. But deep down I knew something was wrong. That night the storm hit. Thunder rumbled in the distance and the rain came down in sheets, but it wasn't the storm that kept me awake. It was the whispers. Faint at first, like the wind playing tricks on my ears. But the longer I lay there in my tent, the louder they became. I couldn't make out what they were saying, if they were saying anything at all. It sounded more like a low murmur, like voices overlapping. The fire outside my tent flickered, casting long, eerie shadows against the nylon. I stepped out, thinking the wind might have been causing the strange noises. But the moment I was outside, the whispers stopped. The fire was dying down, casting only faint light into the clearing. I threw a few more logs onto the flames and scanned the tree line again. Nothing. Only the sound of the rain hitting the leaves and the distant rumble of thunder. The next morning, I decided to pack up and head back. I wasn't going to let some strange noise or shadow ruin my trip, but I couldn't ignore the feeling in my gut anymore. I wasn't welcome here. But as I started to break down my camp, I noticed something strange. Footprints circling the perimeter of my tent. They weren't human, too long, too narrow. They reminded me of some kind of clawed animal, but larger than anything I'd ever seen in these woods. And the strangest part, there were no tracks leading away. It was as if whatever made them had just appeared, walked around, and then vanished. That chill I'd felt before came back, stronger now. I wasn't alone, and whatever was out here wasn't an animal. I hurried to pack up my gear, eyes darting around the clearing, but the woods were still, too still. As I began hiking back, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed. The whispers started again, faint, just on the edge of hearing, but every time I turned around, there was nothing. The rain picked up again, cold and sharp against my skin, making the path muddy and difficult to traverse. The storm hadn't fully passed, and the clouds overhead were thick, swirling in an ominous way that set my nerves even more on edge. After a couple of hours, I reached a dense part of the woods I didn't recognize. The trees were thicker, their branches hanging low like they were trying to block my way. My GPS was malfunctioning, and the compass spun uselessly in my hand. Panic started to creep in. I knew these woods, but somehow I was lost. I pressed on, trying to retrace my steps when I heard it again, louder this time. The whispers coming from all around me, echoing through the trees. And then, just ahead, I saw it. Another figure, standing in the path. It was the same height as the one I saw the night before, but its face was wrong. Pale and featureless, like it wasn't even human. My heart pounded in my chest. I raised my rifle, but my hands were shaking. Before I could decide whether to run or confront it, the figure stepped back into the woods, disappearing behind the trees. But this time, I didn't wait. I turned and ran. The rain was pouring down now, making the ground slippery and treacherous. Branches whipped at my face as I pushed through the undergrowth, but I didn't care. I just needed to get out of there. I ran until my legs burned, and then I ran some more. But no matter how far I went, the whispers followed. Every time I stopped to catch my breath, I could hear them closer now, like they were right behind me. As the light started to fade, I found myself at the edge of a large clearing. In the center was a tree, massive and ancient, with deep carvings etched into its bark. Symbols I didn't recognize. Beneath it, a pile of bones, picked clean, arranged in a way that sent a shiver down my spine. I didn't need to look closer to know they were human. The whispers grew louder, and I knew I had to move. I backed away slowly, rifle still raised, but my hands were trembling too much to aim properly. And then I saw it. The figure was back, standing at the edge of the clearing, its featureless face watching me. I turned and ran again, heart racing, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I didn't stop until I saw the faint outline of the road in the distance. My truck was there, a lifeline in the growing darkness. I jumped in, slammed the door, and floored it, not daring to look back. It's been weeks since that trip, and I haven't been back to the woods since. I won't. Sometimes, late at night, I still hear the whispers. And when I look out the window into the dark woods behind my house, I swear I can see that figure just standing there, watching,